All right, back for video two. I just went ahead and picked right up. I said I was going to go get coffee. I'll wait. I'd like to get ahead and get this knocked out. So we picked up on page 6 for you guys with your reading, and for me it's page 20. But we had just referenced the tragedians entering, and these guys are important. They're very important characters. They're minor characters, but they're very important. Which again, this is part of the like levels of meaning that can come into these plays, because the idea here is that a lot of us are minor players in the world. Most of us are never going to be major players. Okay, I can be very honest and say that my life, I'm a bit player at best. In my life, I'm the star, but in the world, if you look at the world as a stage, which is a line from Shakespeare, I'm not that important. Okay, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean that you still can't have impact. And these minor characters, these tragedians, the player, a guy who actually gets a name, Alfred, and the player who doesn't get a name, all these different people are minor characters in this play, but their message is still really strong, okay? They're important for theme, and they're also important for some of the humor of the play. Now, a lot of their comments are double-edged. They have a literal meaning for the play, but they also have a deeper meaning that points to issues with life in general. Okay, and that's really what we want to look at, is what comments are they making about life. All right. Let me give you an example. They do it kind of early on. Let's see. The player says, "Let us hope so, but to meet two gentlemen on the road, we would not hope to meet them off of it." Rosencrantz goes, "No." The player says, "Well met, in fact, and just in time." Rosencrantz says, "Why is that?" The player says, "Why, we grow rusty, and you catch us at the very point of decadence. By this time tomorrow, we might have forgotten everything we ever knew. That's a thought, isn't it?" He laughs generously. "We'd be back where we started, improvising." Now, what they're pointing out here is these players are excited because they've come across someone who can actually watch them. So they're pointing out that their craft is acting, and if there's no one there to watch them act, they're getting kind of lazy. And he says, we might have even forgotten all of our lines, and then we'd be back to the way we were originally, which was just improvising. That is a comment on life. The fact is that a lot of our lives are just improvising. You would think actors, it's the opposite of that. You know, they have a script. They have all these things laid out for them. This is what you're supposed to do. But he says, you know, a lot of times things don't work out and you can find yourself improvising on stage. Someone else forgets a line. One of the props doesn't do what it's supposed to. There's all sorts of reasons. Now you can just sit there and be caught off guard, or you have to react somehow and improvise. And that's life. Think about how many times we make plans in life and they don't go the way we intended. Did you guys see your senior year ending this way? No, but you have to improvise, because we can be upset and we can be sad. It's still going to be that way. So we have to take the little bit of control we have and find a way to make the best of our situations, okay? All right, so we have that line. We do see a screw up in names. We do see this, like, and it's Rosencrantz who screws up their names, I believe. Yeah, Rosencrantz says, "My name is Guildenstern, and this is Rosencrantz." Guildenstern briefly confers with him, and then without embarrassment, he says, "I'm sorry, his name's Guildenstern, and I'm Rosencrantz." Now, again, that seems completely useless if you haven't read Hamlet. So we know that they were confused frequently, and see, they even confuse themselves here, which is kind of funny, even though we know they're very different people. All right. The bottom of this page, for me, it's page 23. I'm guessing like 7 or 8 maybe for you guys. There's a lot of interchange with it. Talks about the interplay between the influencers, the big people in the world, and then the rest of us. So I don't want to read a lot, but I'm going to have to read this. The player says, "Tragedy, sir, deaths and disclosures, universal and particular, denouement, both unexpected and inexorable, transvestite melodrama on all levels, including the suggestive. We transport you into a world of intrigue and illusion. Clowns, if you like, murderers, we can do your ghosts and battles on the skirmish level, heroes, villains, tormented lovers, set pieces in the poetic vein. We can do you rapiers or rape, or both, by all means, faithless wives and ravished virgins, flagrante delicto at a price. But that comes under realism, for which there are special terms. Getting warm, am I?" Rosencrantz says, "Well, I don't know." The player says, "It costs little to watch and little more if you happen to get caught up in the action, if that's your taste and times being what they are." Well, what are they? Indifferent, bad, wicked. Now, what is your pleasure? Gentlemen, deport yourself. So when the player's saying, hey, we can put on any kind of act for you, he lists a lot of really bad stuff, but it's a comment on life. And by the way, a lot of it's not even real stuff. Transvestite melodrama is not a thing, okay? So what or at least not in theater, but what he's pointing out here is that life is this mixed bag. It's filled with all sorts of different things. And he points out that, a lot of times we just get caught up in it. He says it doesn't cost you anything to watch. It costs you even, does he say even less or just a little more? Something like that. Let me find it. He says, it costs little to watch and little more if you happen to get caught up in the action. So again, that's the indication that, a lot of stuff happens. My life is very boring. I can turn on the news and see all these crazy things happening in the world, and mine is quite boring. But he says, every once in a while you get caught up in it. And so again, their acting is meant to parallel life in general. Okay. So now we get Alfred. Alfred is this very comical yet tragic figure. Alfred has even less control than Rosencrantz and Guildenstern do. It's because of his age, because of his position, but basically he's forced to go through like playing all the female roles for this group, which is a group of male actors. And so Alfred, and which was common in Shakespeare's time and very disturbing. I won't even get on a huge thing about this, but women didn't act on stage. I think there were instances where maybe some did, but most of Shakespeare's plays, it was an all-male cast, and the female roles were played by younger boys. Very creepy, granted. All right. So Alfred represents that character. And think about how little control he has. He doesn't even get to play his part. He has to play someone else's. All right. He represents the bottom rung of the ladder, those with no control over their situation. None at all. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have a little. They could refuse the summons. They could not show up. Of course, in the end, that would not work out well for them. But Alfred has no control. Okay. So we see Alfred. He's kind of funny. There's a lot of this is kind of disturbing. There is a little bit of scandalousness to this. The 50s and 60s are filled with times where people were really bucking the culture. You get the concept of the counterculture. You see things like the beat poets. You see the music that was written that time period. You look at the Beatles when they first came out with that very bubblegum pop, boring nonsense. But then as time goes on, they start producing this really weird, like anti-music music. Because there is this sort of rebellion against things. And we see that in the writing here too. So yes, there are some things in here that are definitely not very appropriate, probably. Going ahead because of time, let's skip a little bit more. I've got some more like really important highlighted passages. There's a lot of interaction here. If you looked, there's a lot of dead space. This is what I was writing about in some of our, I told you there's a lot of reading, but a lot of it's, look at all this empty space here. We get a lot of back and forth between our characters. It's pretty quick reading. But we get some more important parts. For me, page 27, Guildenstern shaking with rage and fright. It could have been, it didn't have to be obscene. It could have been a bird out of season dropping bright feather on my shoulder. Excuse me, it could have been a tongueless dwarf standing by the road to point the way. I was prepared, but it's this, is it? No enigma, no dignity, nothing classical, pretentious, only a comic pornographer and a rabble of prostitutes. And the player says, acknowledging the description with the sweep of his hat, bowing sadly, you should have caught us in better times. We were purists then. And then he says, onward. Now, again, Guildenstern is commenting on the little play they put on, saying that it was filthy. The concept of it was filthy. And he's like, I expected all of these things, and this is what I got. And then the player says, well, you should have seen us back in the day. We actually, did what we were supposed to once upon a time. That's another parallel to life. You expect certain things out of life, and some of you are going to get those things, and that's awesome. A lot of you are not. All right. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just you're prepared for certain things to come out of life. You're going to go to college. A lot of you probably don't think college is going to be that difficult. For some of you, maybe it won't be. All right. But you're going to go to college. You're going to meet that perfect person. You guys you're going to graduate. You're going to go to master's program or get your PhD or whatever, or go straight into work at that point. And you're going to get married, and you're going to have, a boy and a girl, and you're going to have that perfect little house in the suburbs, and you're going to work at the same job for the next 40 years in whatever city you've picked out to live in, and life's going to be perfect. And of course, there's going to be, little hiccups here and there, but for the most part, everything's going to be great. And that's what you're kind of preparing yourself for. And hopefully that's what happens. But as Guildenstern points out, it's not always that way. For some people, especially those of us who don't have a lot of control, things like coronavirus happen, or things like the economy crashes. That happens, and things that you can't control. I remember back in 2008, man, I had my career laid out. I was going to start teaching at a public school in Georgia. I was going to stay at that school. I was going to help open that school, be one of the first teachers they hired. I was going to teach there the rest of my life because I loved that area. and become head of the department one day, and while I was doing that, go to school at the University of Georgia and take classes until eventually maybe I could teach there. That was the plan. The economy crashed. That was in 2008. The school was shut down. They didn't open it. And I had to move back to Mobile and live with my mom for 6 months as a grown man, a married man with children. Had to move in with her and then take a job at a private school, which I swore I never was going to do because, guys, I'm a public school teacher deep down. I enjoy teaching you guys, but y'all don't need me the way the public school kids did. Most of you have good influences at home. I know some of you don't, but most of you do. So I'm not as necessary for you as I was for my public school kids. What I bring as a teacher is not needed by a lot of you. I'm learning that this year. So, he says you can prepare all you want, but this is what you've got. And as you get older, you become more and more pessimistic about life. That's what the player is saying. He's like, you should have seen us back in the day when we were purists. But he's like, because of all the stuff that's happened to us, we don't care anymore. What else have we got? 27, 28. This is a good one. The player says, we keep to our usual stuff more or less, only inside out. We do on stage the things that are supposed to happen off, which is a kind of integrity if you look on every exit as being an entrance somewhere else. That is such a cool line. Every exit off of stage is an entrance into something else. And that represents, again, a thing about life. The ending of one thing is always the beginning of something else. So it's kind of a cool little line. All right, let me go up. So Guildenstern decides to keep playing his coin game, but instead of playing with Rosencrantz, now he starts playing with the players, and he keeps losing. There's even a point where, I don't know if it's Rosencrantz or Guildenstern. Again, it's so easy to confuse the two, but they make a statement of make a bet with the player, the main player we see, and he says, I bet you such and such that if we double a birth date, if it's odd, I win. If it's even, you win. And here's the trick to that. You may not have caught it. If you double any day, it's always going to be even. Think about it. If you double an even number, 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. 8 plus 8 is 16. These are all even numbers. But think about what happens if you do it if you add together two odd numbers. 1 and 1 is 2. 3 and 3 is 6. 7 and 7 is 14. Now, you can add an odd and an even and end up with an odd. But if you're just going to double things, they're always going to end up even. So he's playing a game he can't win. And again, obviously, that's a concept about life for some of us. Some of us, depending on what your definition of winning is, some of us, it's just you're not going to do that. When I taught public school over in this little small area in Florida, I had all these kids who you'd ask them what they wanted to do for a living. They'd say stuff like, I want to be a millionaire. And you would just deep down, it would hurt to hear them say that because they're in an area that's one of the most impoverished areas of Florida. They're coming from zero resources, most of these kids. Most of them don't have cars. So even if they're able to get into college, the closest college was about 30 to 45 minutes away. So you had to drive there. There was no other way to get there. There was no public transportation. You weren't taking a bus there. Nothing like that. So even if you were smart enough to get in, and it was a commuter school. There weren't places to live on campus. If you were going to live on campus, you had to go an hour north, east, south, or west. And so a lot of these kids, they were not going to win this thing. And you know what? There's no jobs in the town. Product of the world we live in. Everything's bought online. Walmart's one town over, and you go over there to buy all your stuff. All the local stuff just falls apart. So none of that would work out for them. And these guys you didn't see people get out of this situation. There were no jobs. Most of them started relying on the government, and then a lot of them started relying on drugs. It's the number one, it was anyway when I lived there, the number one county for meth production. So, and before meth became a big deal, growing up in the, we had grown up in the 50s or 60s, it was the number one spot for marijuana at the time. So, that's all people did. So these people were set out to lose before it began. Now, I know there's this beautiful idea that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you really want it, you can do it. And sure, you can start working at 16 and put aside all the money you want so that you can buy a rinky-dink car that can drive you to that junior college that's 30 minutes away. And you can do really good in school because you could get a scholarship and get that paid for. And then, you could, with that, turn that into a better job and get you a better car to move to another city. You could do that. But I hate to say this, most of you out there right now watching this, it's hard enough to get you to focus long enough to watch these videos and do the work. A lot of you aren't doing it. You may be doing the work, but I mean, I can see my video hits. I can see how few people are actually paying attention to this. To get you to do that is difficult. Can you imagine what it's like to get kids who have no support system to actually buckle down and do things that even mature adults don't do? Sometimes it feels like you set out to lose. And that's this whole flipping coins thing. It's like, you're not going to win this. All right. Page 33 for me, skipping ahead a little bit, we get two really powerful quotes. The player says, "They're hardly divisible, sir. Well, I can do you blood and love without the rhetoric, and I can do you blood and rhetoric without the love, and I can do you all three concurrent or consecutive, but I can't do you love and rhetoric without the blood. Blood is compulsory. They're all blood, you see." Again, he's talking about what types of plays they can put on. He's pointing out that violence is always going to be a part of it, because that's life. All right, life is filled with this sort of thing. Guildenstern points out, is that what people want? And the player says, it's what we do. All right. Again, he brings you that whole question of what comes first. Is it what the people want, and that's why the players do it, or do the players do it and they do it so well that the people want it? All right. And again, we thrive on bad news. Mr. Morgan and I were talking just the other day about the news was putting out like rumors, and by the time you watch this, maybe we have some clarity on this. But when I'm making this video, no clue what happened with Kim Jong-un. Is he alive? Is he dead? No one knows. But a lot of the news reports were going into this great detail about him dying. I showed Mr. Morgan this funny headline I had from the New York Post that said Kim Jong-un is either dead, in a vegetative state, or he's just fine. Well, let me let you know a secret. That's all of us. All right. They basically said nothing. And I was pointing out how stupid it is to say that. And I said, why are they even reporting this? And Mr. Morgan pointed out that that's where the money is. And I said, that's where we have a problem, because the news should never have been about money. You should be able to present the news as, here are the facts, here's what's going on, the end. But you can't. You have things like Fox News and CNN who have a viewer base who supports them and watches their shows, which makes those ads that they sell on their shows, makes them able to charge as much as they do, because they can say, look, we have so many millions of viewers, so they have to cater to those people. If you're CNN and you have a liberal base, or you're Fox News and you have a conservative base, you have to tailor your news to those people, to saying what they want to hear, because otherwise they're not going to watch it, or they're going to call you fake news or whatever else nonsense we're doing today. So, which, by the way, they all are to some degree that, okay? I mean, they're basically just catering to what you want to hear. But the good news it doesn't get any hits. We want to see the train wreck. Why is our news producing these stories about all the awful things that are going to happen? Like, this virus is going to come back in the fall and it's going to be even worse, and our economy is going to collapse even more, and blah, blah, blah. Why? Why are you saying that? First of all, you're completely guessing and scaring people. Why? Because that's the stories people read. I tell you, that's the first thing I click on. Now, I have gone out of my way to look for positive stories now to make me feel better, but the player's not wrong. People want the bad stories. That's why TV shows are built around, like, my favorite types of TV shows are those gritty cop dramas like The Wire, and things like Sons of Anarchy, which isn't a cop drama, but still stuff like that. And they show you the worst of people, but that's what we gravitate towards. It's really weird. Oh man, I love the very first time I read this. Now, every time I read this, I have to pick up other things because it's just so deep and it's a dense work. But at the bottom right here, it says, the player, Guildenstern says, well, aren't you going to change into your costume? And the player says, I never change out of it, sir. And that, again, the idea that we all are playing this role, and it's not who we really are, but we never really change out of these things. Sorry. So something weird happens, though, and I'll explain to you why. They're still flipping coins, and the player, let me kind of jump up here. The player says, I'll give you a wave. He's talking about when he starts. Says he doesn't move. His immobility is now pointed and getting awkward. Pause. Rosencrantz walks up to him, and they are still face to face. Rosencrantz says, excuse me? Pause. The player lifts his downstage foot. It was covering the Guildenstern's coin. Rosencrantz puts his foot on the coin, smiles. Thank you. The player turns and goes. Rosencrantz is bent for the coin. So they were flipping a coin earlier, and when it fell on the ground, they didn't get to see what it was, and the player was standing on it. And, of course, Rosencrantz this entire time is still playing this stupid game. And he says, excuse me, he wants him to move so he can look at the coin. So the player steps back, and Rosencrantz puts his foot on the coin until no one's looking. And then he glances down at it. Listen to what happens. Now, we can expect it's going to say heads, right? Guildenstern says, "Come on." Rosencrantz I say that was lucky. Guildenstern says, "What?" Rosencrantz looks and he says, "It was tails." So for the first time, the coin's tails, which represents this change in fate. And miraculously, immediately, all of a sudden, the stage would go. You probably have this set on. There's two. Like this is all happening on one side of the stage. The lights go out and the lights come up on the second half, and Hamlet appears. It's the Hamlet and Ophelia scene, which Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were not part of. So they're not in this. They're off to the side. But the coin flip has changed because fate's changed. Because now that Hamlet's in the room, Hamlet impacts fate. Hamlet changes fate because of who he is. And it's not so much because Hamlet's a powerful person as far as intrinsically, but his position makes him a person of power. All right, and that's what alters that. Okay, so we'll get several scenes with Hamlet there. And I noticed that even though they weren't there for this section, they're going to feel the effects of it. Again, you and I aren't in Washington, D.C. for a lot of the decisions Congress makes, but we still definitely feel the effects of it. You and I don't, and most of you that are watching this weren't old enough to vote in the last, I don't think any of you were old enough to vote in the last congressional elections. So you have literally no control over what happened, but yet the policies that Congress makes today or this time period are going to impact you down the road. And they're going to continue to impact our country way down the road, in fact, even though you had no control over it. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the play. All right, we're going to skip ahead a decent amount. Let's see. Okay, at one point, and we're getting near the end of it here in my book. Again, I can't really pull. I've got my notes here, so pulling up the text that you guys are reading the notes and the camera is just really not an option. So I apologize for this. Hopefully, you did some highlighting of your own, and you can kind of find these. For me, I'm on page 38. Let me just go ahead and kind of give you guys an update on where we are for you. For you guys, this is going to be goodness, this cough. We're looking at around, let me try to find, okay, Hamlet and Ophelia scene. Claudius and Polonius. Guys, we're around, let me see, did Polonius and Claudius already happen? Yeah. I'm looking for where Rosencrantz says it's all stopping to a death. That's the key line. Guys, I don't know. It's around 17, 18, 19, somewhere in there, okay? But Rosencrantz makes the statement, it's all stopping to a death. And it's kind of funny because we all know they're going to die because of this. They'll make several comments about death throughout this, which are really interesting. Again, the irony is, and this dramatic irony, that we know what's coming for these two poor guys. I like this section a lot. There's some discussion about questions. They start playing a question game. And the question game is basically designed where if you and I were playing this, I would say something, say in the form of a question, and you would have to react with another question, but it has to somehow be tied to what I said. And you lose when someone answers or they can't provide a question. Okay, I know it's kind of confusing, but if you read it, you can kind of see them doing this. But a little bit before that, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are talking, and Guildenstern says, there, and we'll soon be home and dry and high and dry. Has it ever happened to you that all of a sudden, for no reason at all, you haven't the faintest idea how you spell the word wife or house? Because when you write it down, you just can't remember ever having seen those letters in that order before. Rosencrantz goes, I remember. Now there's a big dash because he gets cut off. Guildenstern says, yes. Rosencrantz says, I remember when there were no questions. And Guildenstern says, there were always questions. To exchange one set for another is no great matter. I love that comment. The idea that, when you were little, you had questions about things like, how did the stars get in the sky? And why is the sky blue? And, how does Santa Claus come down a chimney when we don't have a chimney? Stuff like that, little questions. But then as we get older, there's still questions. And the funny thing about these questions is they're never really answered a lot of the time. I mean, you may have been told, with Santa Claus, this is how that happens. And your parents may have had some really clever idea, or they may have just broken and told you didn't exist, whatever. But the fact is that, a lot of the questions we have throughout life, we never really get an answer to. And like Guildenstern points out, we just exchange them for another set of questions. He says, we've always had them, and we never get the answers. That's the thing that they're going to get a lot in this play, is the idea that there's lots of questions with no answer. All right, let's see. There's a really cool analogy on the next page for this. Guildenstern's talking. He says, we can't afford anything quite so arbitrary, nor do we come all this way for christening. All that preceded us. but we are comparatively fortunate. We might have been left to sift the whole field of human nomenclature like two blind men looting a bazaar for their own portraits. At least we were presented with alternatives. I told you earlier there's people like Alfred who have no control. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or Guildenstern here is indicating at least we have some control over our lives. Because we could be like, when you really think about this analogy, it is such a cool analogy. We could have been two blind men looting a bazaar for our own portraits. Think about what's weird about that. I mean, looting a bazaar for your own portrait by itself would be hard. A bazaar being like just like a flea market, all right? But what's so much even more ironic? Blind men don't know what they look like. They don't know the most basic thing about what they themselves look like. They don't even know that. So you can imagine the futility of this scene. All right, it's kind of a cool thing. Guildenstern's going to say a couple of times a play on the Lord's Prayer. Yeah, the Lord's Prayer. I had to do it in my head. This is the first time I think we see it. He says, "Give us this day our daily mask." He's going to have several different words he uses. Give us this day our daily something else, but a lot of them revolve around being fake and and not being who you truly are. Which we've seen that with the players earlier. We're seeing it with them here. Like I said, there's a lot happening in these few pages. Every time you read, you can come up with some different things. Skipping ahead, we get one of the famous lines from this. Guildenstern says, "Words, words, they're all we have to go on." And again, and like I said, we're jumping everywhere. The point here is not to tell you what's happening. If you were to sit down and write a summary of this play, it would be really difficult to do because there's just it's nonsense in a lot of ways. But there are a lot of really cool lines, there's a lot of really cool thoughts, and they're all kind of crammed into this envelope. But the words are all we have to go on. He's talking about the value of language. And, of course, Stopper's going to write about that. He's a writer. Writers care about the words. But he says, words are all we have to go on. And again, there's a literal element of it, but the figurative element here is that's how life works. I mean, you basically, have to go on what I tell you about things and what I tell you about myself. You can gauge my actions too, but so much of what we depend on is based on words. So that's really all we have to go on because you can't know what I'm thinking in my head. Even when I go to describe it to you using my words, they get confused, and it comes down to how you interpret them. So, they're pointing out the futility of our communication. Communication, in fact, most of our problems in the world come from just not understanding another group, not understanding where they come from, not understanding how they feel. Right now, we live in a very tenuous and very contentious, contentious political spectrum where if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, the other side's automatically the enemy and you treat them like they're idiots because they don't see it your way. Guys, we don't all have the same background. To a Democrat, something a Republican says may seem completely asinine, but if you were to understand where that person was coming from, you could see why they feel that way. One of the best articles I ever read came when President Trump was elected, 4 years ago, and a guy wrote about how much he despised President Trump, but he talked with a Republican who voted for him, and when he listened to the guy explain why he voted for him, he all of a sudden found himself still hating the president, but having a lot more empathy for that person because the guy basically was saying, look, I don't hate minorities. I don't believe in most of what the Republican Party said. He said, but as a middle-class white Christian, I feel like I'm the enemy to everyone and that no one's paying attention to me and that I don't have a voice and I was just looking for a voice, and he explained, here's what I'm struggling with. And he explained the problems he has because you can think about like middle-class white person, ooh, your life must be so tough. But in a lot of ways, for some people, it is. It's a different kind of tough. And as he was explaining it, this guy was listening to him and was like, I never thought about it from that angle. I'm not a Republican at this point, is what he was thinking, but I have a lot more sympathy for people who are. And I can see why they feel this way. And trying to get inside the mind of other people, we just don't do that. We automatically, they come out and say something and we automatically interpret it through our lens. And that's a problem. And that's what we're seeing a lot of in this play, okay? I'm going way too long, guys. I apologize. Go a little further, Rosencrantz, he's at the footlights. He's at the bottom of the stage. Because how very intriguing. I feel like a spectator, an appalling business. The only thing that makes it bearable is their irrational belief that somebody interesting will come on in a minute. Okay. And of course, it's really funny because they're using some irony here because he's talking about the stage and feeling like he's a spectator, which obviously he's not. He's the actor here. But he says the only thing that makes, and this is a double meaning, he says the only thing that makes life bearable is the idea that someone interesting will come on eventually. And we can do so much with that statement. You can talk about it in the literal sense they're talking about, which of course we know Hamlet's about to come back on stage. So for them, someone interesting is about to come on. But it could also mean in life that it's a series of disappointments and boredom until something more interesting happens. It also goes even further than that when we look beyond just the timeline and think about, we're all waiting for death and for what God's got for us next. The play Waiting for Godot is a play on that. Godot is spelled Godot. The play is about two bums sitting around waiting for God, and they're not sure if he's already come by. They don't know what he looks like. They don't know how to know if he comes by. And it's just this big ambiguous thing of these guys waiting for something that they're not sure is going to happen, or if it has happened already. So that's what we're getting here with Guildenstern, is kind of a reference to that. And then Guildenstern looks at the footlights. He says, "What a fine persecution, to be kept intrigued without ever quite being enlightened." And again, that's the idea about you always have questions, but they're not answered a lot. He says, what a horrible thing to think that if these questions will never be answered. All right, if you look at the pages in this book, look at all the dead space here. All right, a lot of back and forth here, and we're just going to go through all of that. This is where they're playing that question game I mentioned earlier, all right? And then we get towards the end here, okay? The question game is symbolic. The point here, and they're trying to parallel this as life again, is that it's a bunch of questions without answers, all right? Why do people behave the way they do? To us, it seems like it's so pointless, but yet you'll never get an answer for it. If Jeff Bezos could take a third of his income that he has for this year and could make sure no one goes hungry for the next 5 years, for lots of people, why doesn't he do that? That just seems like basic sense. He could still live better than you or me with 2/3 of his income, and yet he could fix everyone else's life. So why doesn't he? Well, there's a question you'll not get answered. We can guess, we can go ask him, and he can tell us the reason, but it still may or may not be true. And you're never going to get an answer for that. Why is it that good people work, go outside, they do everything right, they exercise, they're kind, they never break any laws, and yet they end up dead at the age of 45 from cancer? And then somebody who's a terrible human being, who's a drug addict, lives to be 86. You'll never get an answer. We're just going to keep getting these questions with no answers. And that frustrates a lot of people. And that's where Guildenstern is at this point in the play. All right. He's very frustrated. He doesn't feel like he's ever going to get any answers. And he says that's such a terrible thing. So the act ends on another Hamlet scene. We get the interaction between Hamlet and the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that we saw in the actual play of Hamlet. But it fades out because all the Hamlet scenes, for the most part, don't happen. They happen off stage in this play. While, because we already know what's happening there. And it's meant to be about what happens to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern off stage in Hamlet, to be honest with you. So lots of confusion here. You probably aren't liking this, to be honest with you. Probably a couple cool lines, definitely some food for thought. But at this point, you might find yourself a little bit confused. Don't worry, it stays confusing. The action does. There's a lot more cool stuff to come, though, including some of my favorite lines from literature we're going to see, I think, in the next act. So again, I apologize for the length of this. We're trying to tackle an entire act, and I skipped a lot, guys. I really did, because the only way to really do this properly is to do it in a classroom setting, or for me to read it to you and stop and discuss each line. And I just can't do that. I can't do it for copyright reasons, and I can't do it because it would take forever. So keep reading. If you have questions, send them to me. We can do video conferencing. You can email me. You can text me. You can call me. Any way you want to get up with me. If you're having any confusion, we can talk through it, or we can just be confused together in some instances, okay? All right, so I hope this was helpful. I hope it helped clear, it helped unmuddy the water a little. Who knows if it did or didn't. I know these videos are not the best organized. I promise you I did my prep work. I got my notes over here to the right, and I'm trying to stick to them, but it's kind of hard. So anyway, thanks for your time, guys. Later this week, probably Wednesday, I'll put out the Act 2 videos. All right, I may get them tomorrow. We'll just have to see how it goes. Got a lot of grading to do this week, so I got to try to get caught up. All right, thank you guys for your time. I hope that you are doing okay. I hope you were able to follow along. The next time I do the videos, I'll try to have your text up so that I'm not just willy-nilly discussing things and you have no clue where I am. All right, guys, well, thank you again, and I will see you in my next video.